This is part 2 of a discussion with the infamous Adam Chernoff, who does very little media, so we're very grateful he's here. To pick up where we left off.
Hold on. Let's set odds. Let's set odds here. Is second half better or worse than the first half? We'll put a money line on it.
I think I like the first half, but I think the second half might be a little bit more thought provoking and more personal.
Minus 140 plus 120.
Yeah.
Minus 170 because we're going to quiz you on a couple of teams that you previewed, and so I think we'll have a back and forth. I'm going minus 170.
Minus 170.
We're going to save current content because we want these videos to be evergreen, to last for years and to be of value. So we're going to save any current season stuff till the end. I want to ask you, Adam, who has influenced you the most to arrive where you are today? Who gave you a helping hand, and who taught you the most? That might be 3 different people, might be 1.
Whoa.
You may or may not be able to mention them by name, but you can describe their position.
I didn't see that question coming.
That's what we're about here.
Yeah, there we go. Evergreen content. So we'll keep it to strictly the betting side. So the first one would be a man, his name is Richard Williams, but he was the guy who gave me my first job. I still don't even consider it a job, but it was in Trinidad and Tobago. He had a legal, it was called a members club, but it was a slot house. There were 100 machines or so, a couple blackjack tables, and then they put betting in it. And so I was the bookmaker that went around it. So that was my first job into it. And I would say that the reason it was important was because it allowed me to go through the betting industry. And he ultimately got me my second job, which was a serious position in the Bahamas. But what he set me up to do was essentially, without knowing it, and I don't think he knew it at the time, but I got to make almost every mistake that you could make as a bookmaker from 2010 till I stopped in 2015. And that went from making the mistake in that slot house with a handful of people betting money that was relatively irrelevant to, by the end of it, we had a site that was turning over several million a month, and they had 30 plus retail locations, and I was still making mistakes at that level. So that would be one for sure that really kind of set me up in a weird way to go down that path. And then I would say from a podcast or presentation perspective, never met him, never knew him, but learned about him and read a lot of his stuff. There was a sports writer. His name was Alan Malamud, and he wrote. I know. There you go. He wrote notes on a scorecard.
Great column, Herald Examiner in my area.
As good as ever, and it was Twitter before there was Twitter, but in an article about baseball. And the way that he wrote about sports in short, concise pieces, really, I think, sort of indirectly shaped how I created the podcast and a lot of the media that I started doing, where it was short, concise, putting things to the point. From a betting side, I think I've learned a ton from a lot of different people throughout Twitter, but I would specifically point out to someone within a betting group, and I'll leave it to saying the group is probably located close to California, but they really have helped me without sort of needing to or really having to in any sort of way, just through conversations, really allowed me to say, here's what I think. Is this right or wrong? Correct me where I'm wrong. Show me something that I'm missing here. And they've been really willing to help me out in that regard. So there's a big influence behind that. And I wish they were more public and out in the open for what they're doing. It's kind of shifting that way, but maybe we'll hear more about them. And that may set up for another episode or two where I learned a lot from that side. So a lot of people, but those are kind of 3 that stand out here on the spot for sure.
A related question would be, we all have done this, have had this happen where something happens to you and it changes your life. What are one or two instances of pure luck other than COVID? Because I know that you had a job all set up with a major bookmaker in the US and COVID prevented you from that transition. What one or two instances of pure luck other than the COVID sent you in direction of focus and success?
The last 15 years, almost every single thing that I've done. Honestly, it goes back. Well, it goes back to, so like junior high, early high school, got in just a ton of trouble with betting. And I think anybody would that was doing it almost all day at age 14 and 15. It's never a good situation, but like just little things. Grade 12, I went back to where I grew up, town of 2,400 people. And it was like I was the one guy of a graduating class of less than 20 that said that he was going to travel. And I was supposed to go to Antigua because I knew it from betting and there were books down there. And last minute, the apartment fell through. And so the reservation was canceled. And I only had so much money that I had to find a place for super cheap. The only place that showed up was the Dominican Republic. But because of peer pressure from the other students that said you would never travel, I went anyway, which led me to going to a bar at the right time to meet Richard, who set me up with the job. And I went to Trinidad and happened to meet the person in the Bahamas who then gave me the next job. And then that led to 5 years in the industry, which led me to be able to start up the podcast, which somehow came across the guys at VSiN who then had me on there. It just accumulated to just weird occurrences that if one of them in some sequence didn't happen, like there's no way that it would have worked out. So that's a whole episode in itself that it can be told, but it's there's so many of them that that's just how life goes. I guess you just keep going with it and you end up in the right spot, and a lot of times you don't know why, but it ultimately works out.
Ron, fire away.
Fire away. Okay. I'm going to go out of sequence here, but we'll take the crossover data. You do all this work for 2022, let's say, and then you're expecting certain things. But then after a few weeks, you see what's happening and you see what the numbers are. When do you leave your 2021 numbers and projections for 2022 and rely on just the data for 2022? I know it could be different team by team in the NFL, depending on their schedule and so on. I think Chris uses 3 weeks. I use 4 weeks. Is there any particular time that you say, now I'm just going on the results on the field for this year?
I think really fast. I couldn't say there's a set time, but in general, I think really, really quickly, because I think that the quicker that you are willing to abandon it and trust what you see happening, the quicker you're going to get ahead of any changes that will happen market-wise, because it adjusts so fast. So I would say that I'm a lot more willing to abandon it quickly. What I do hold on to, especially within division games, is like pricing history from a year ago. And I think that can really help a handicap. Perfect example, Patriots Dolphins week 1. So their total is 44.5. Last year, they played late in the year, and the total was right at basically the same number, a touch lower. I can't remember exactly. It was, I want to say 43. Really good case of where you can use that pricing from last year and say like, okay, Dolphins offense, better or worse?
Better.
It's overwhelmingly better. Yeah, with you. Defense, better or worse? Yeah. Probably slightly better, but neutral. Patriots side, that's where the handicap gets interesting. So it's like offense, I think it's way better. You guys agree, disagree, neutral?
I think it'll be better. It'll be more up tempo, obviously.
I think a combination of maybe better and maybe more electric in the return game. They drafted 2 guys with speed, and so a team that didn't have many long gainers, that might add to the offense. So I would say slightly better because of the dynamic of adding speed.
And then Patriots defense, better or worse?
Yeah, worse.
I'd say slightly worse too. Yeah.
So there's a perfect game. So we're looking at a point difference from where we were last year, give or take half a point. And we're like, okay, both of these teams are better on offense and either neutral or worse on defense. So we carried it over from last year, but it's like, shouldn't this total be higher if we think that and we think it about the team? And stuff like that will carry through a lot of the year. So while I'm willing to change on teams, there's kind of that baseline from a price perspective that I think I hold on to longer than I will an opinion on a team that I'm not willing to change.
I'm just surprised that so many people seem to carry over last year's data, throughout the season. I mean, they kind of changed the formula and they drop off weeks, or they make the new season gradually more important than last season. And I look back at the previous seasons, and you look at some of these teams that are not even going to resemble what's on the field this year, and there's a lot of those teams. So how can you carry over that data? I just don't understand what the point of it is. I think it's for me, I just prefer to wait 3 weeks before it has any influence on me. And also, any predispositions I have on a team, I'm certainly not going to make an adjustment after week 1. My ears are going to perk up week 2, and maybe something will come into play. And then after seeing 3 weeks, then I really have to consider making changes.
Yeah, and part of it, what makes that tough too, I think, is you don't know, looking in reverse without a lot of work, what the situation was. Was the quarterback for the opponent hurt? Was the opponent missing wide receivers? What went into it? It's a lot of work to try to figure that out and really carry it over, because a lot of the numbers are misleading. And again, it goes back to what we were saying in part 1, where kind of when everyone's dialed in on that one stat or that one angle that maybe isn't entirely true because of something else, that's where a lot of value tends to lie. And so, like, if you don't know that Miami played that run of 7 games last year against really bad quarterback situations for opponents, and you look at it and you say, okay, well, this team finished the year really strong, that's a lot of positive sort of optimism to carry into this year with the full camp and a new coach and everything tied in. Well, there's reason for optimism in 2022, but it's not because they finished beating up a bunch of bad teams. It's something entirely different. So, like, how do you account for it can be so misleading, I think, at many times.
2 things that may cause me to act quicker on a couple of teams. 9 new coaches, so you're going to be evaluating all kinds of new schemes and stuff like that. So I don't want to wait 4 weeks if I see something really drastically different. An offensive-minded coach, was replaced by a defensive-minded coach, or vice versa. And then unprecedented change in the wide receiver group. Tyreek Hill leaves one team and goes to another.
Yep.
I think we have six receivers that actually changed teams for $20 or more million. So, and a couple of quarterbacks like Russell Wilson changed. So that's a drastic shift that has to be evaluated, and can't hold on to the 2021 data as long as I would want to.
Work with me on this one. There's some math and thinking. Depending on the schedule, there's not really any repeats in the first 4 weeks of the year. In the first 4 weeks, in theory, unless there's repeats, every team will have 4 opponents, and those 4 opponents will have 4 opponents. So you get to essentially a full season if you're willing to look deep enough into how specific units have performed against other teams relative to expectation. It's a lot of extra work and piecing together, but you can find a lot of conclusions off of that based on a lot of those changes, rather than needing to wait till week 8 or 9. I think being able to go back through the box scores after the game is done to figure out what's really going on, but then also apply that to all the opponents that are being faced when you're evaluating offensive or defensive units, you can really learn a lot based on the strength of those opponents that they're facing. Because early in the year, you may have the Cleveland Browns, for example, are going to be a fascinating team, and they have just a layup of a schedule the first 4 weeks.
Yep. Right.
But those 4 opponents that they're going to face we'll know a lot more about. If you look back at the Browns' first 4 games, you'll be able to tell just how bad those 4 teams were by looking at the other 3 games those 4 teams played. And that will give you a different weighting on the Browns, because those opponents they faced have now played 3 additional games. And then you can work your way back and say, like, all these teams were even worse than we thought of. And that makes in turn the Browns potentially worse if they're winning those games than perhaps expectation suggests. And that's another way that you can kind of speed up the NFL season with less data. Did that make any sense at all? Or was
That's
that
a roundabout way of what I was going to say next. That we've seen over the last few years that the general public has been educated about how to look at season wins. You don't look at last year's record and transfer it over. You look at things from based on what they're supposed to do week to week overall going forward. Strength of schedule, I think, is going to be the next thing that people are going to become aware of, because everybody just refers to strength of schedule and they look at all the teams that they play. And you touched on it. You have to look at what was going on with each of those teams and whether teams gave extra effort or no, weak effort, and work in all the dynamics that were going on when these teams played. And it's time consuming, but that's the real strength of schedule. You can't just glance at strength of schedule based on win-loss records or all these other variables. Thoughts on that?
What was the name of the movie on Apple that Teddy was in with Alan Boston and the other guy?
The Best of It?
The Best of It.
Yeah.
There's a clip in there where they're in Alan Boston's house, and he's got his desk set up, and he's got all the notebooks laid out with all the loose leaf papers, and he's talking about how when a team is, if they're leading by 20 at the half and they cover, that's a better performance and cover than if a team is trailing by 15 and they come back and they get in the back door. And he's going to rate those teams differently. I think that was a really good chunk of that movie. And like you said, when it comes to strength of schedule, people do one of 2 things. They sum up the win percentage of the opponents from a year ago and use that to project what's going on in 2022, ignoring all of the changes, or they just copy what's in Warren Sharp's book. That number. And so it's one of 2 things. What's missing within that is exactly what Alan was saying in that movie, where you can go back and you take a team like the Detroit Lions, best team against the spread in all of football. Everybody loves to bet on them a year ago. Everybody loves them going into 2022. 61% of their offensive snaps a year ago were with them trailing by a field goal or more. That's a massive percentage of the season they were playing from behind.
Was it only 61? I thought it was higher.
61 was by a field goal or more they were trailing. Okay. So it was only, I believe it was 17% of snaps all season. It was like 181 of 1,050 offensive snaps were with the lead.
Right.
Right. And so it's like, how much credit do we really give them a year ago? Because so much of their offensive performance was in a situation where all other teams in the NFL perform better on offense. Right. And so that's the type of thing that strength of schedule doesn't take into account. It misses all of that with how many of the ways that the people go. And it also doesn't account for a lot of the QB changes, like you were saying, Ron. So it's a tricky number. But again, the theme here is kind of like, where is strength of schedule misrepresented? That's probably where there's value.
So you just talked about quarterbacks. We've talked about quarterbacks and so on. One of the adjustments I've had to make is because of the rule changes, more scoring, quarterbacks are wearing skirts. You can't touch a wide receiver after 5 yards and all that. And that's going to be emphasized again this year, as I just read a few days ago. I've had to place more weight on quarterback performance where I wouldn't have otherwise. Is there something like that you've had to do where you've said you can no longer win with an average quarterback? Of course, we might find that out with Daniel Jones and some of these others. But are you valuing quarterbacks, for example, more? Are you valuing coaches more?
I'm laughing because you're having a battle with the earphone on your right ear.
I know.
That has been a 65-minute struggle. Have I waited? Well, I think quarterbacks are by far the most important. So anything kind of off of that position-wise is tough. In part one, I kind of emphasized the secondary part of it. I had Eric Eager from Pro Football Focus, who's brilliant. I had him on a lot last year for stuff I was doing in the playoffs. And his stance that he takes is the depth at cornerback. So specifically number 3, 4, 5, because so many teams have extended the skill within their wide receiver rooms to where he believes that we kind of misevaluate a lot of that. And it makes all the sense in the world. And I desperately want to have something that I can sort of look at and put a value on that in a different way. But like 2020 almost like scares me from getting back into that because I made so many bad bets trying to bet against secondaries or on ones that weren't injured or were injured. Mm-hmm. So I think I haven't done much beyond the quarterback, but I'm convinced that there's something there in the defensive secondary that we collectively as bettors miss. I just don't know how to do it. And the other one that really stands out to me is pressure rate. That stat is thrown around like crazy everywhere. But I still have no idea how to take a good pressure rate versus a bad offensive line and put that into a point spread. The Super Bowl was a perfect example. We knew that the Bengals offensive line was horrible. We knew the Rams pass rush was really good. It had an impact on the game, but was that 1 point? Was that 2 points? Was it 3 more? I don't know. It's really hard to do that where with quarterbacks, I can pretty confidently tell you what the difference is between Mitch Trubisky and Mason Rudolph, right? But I can't tell you what the difference is for the best pressure rate and the worst pressure rate against the bad offensive line. I wish I knew, but I think there's probably an edge there too. I just don't know what it is.
I agree with you. This injury thing I ignored for years and years. And, you know, it was always considered already factored in the spread in my thinking. And now that I've had more time to keep up on it, and you've got Pro Football Doc out there and injury and COVID issues, to look at the cluster issues, and it always seems like I was overcompensating for any sort of injury change to my line. And I've heard that from other people. And you just basically said the same thing, right?
It happens so much. And it's so easy to get into when you're sitting at an odds screen all day and you have alerts ticking on. I'm strapped into the watch for the whole season now because I put it on every August, and you get 50 alerts a day and you think every single one of them matters. And you're like, should I be betting on this? Every time you get one. And it's like 50 yes-no decisions in your head per day. And maybe you act on like one of them that actually matters. But it's so easy to just get clicking and be too trigger happy with the mouse. But I find it so hard, yet so easy at the same time to think about injuries on the defensive side of the football. There's a chance that none of them provide any edge. There's a chance that a lot of them do. I just don't know how to think about it. I wish
I've checked all the NFL rosters, and there's no invisible men on the roster. So there's always players to take these the places of these people.
Yeah, and the problem with the secondary stuff, it's like, okay, so you take the Pats, who are just an extremely high rate of man coverage, and they lose some guys, but like a couple injuries, and they have to shift to zone probably really early in the season in 2022, which will kind of turn them into maybe a slightly more aggressive version of the Eberflus Colts that we talked about based on the personnel they have. And so you hear that in your head and you're like, well, that's going to be a really good thing to bet against. But then it's like, well, is it a bad thing if they're just forcing 3 or 4 yard completions? Because if you're going to bet against a team going from man to zone, like, okay, well, there's going to be more points scored because the coverage is less aggressive. But because it's so passive, it like forces shorter completions and it keeps the clock moving. And so it's such a weird thing to get your head around, because even when you think you're acting on it in the right way, it often leads to something else happening that you didn't account for. So it's hard with injuries on the defensive side.
Yeah, I think we spend in general a little too much time on injuries if they're not cluster injuries or quarterbacks. I'd rather go back to matchup analysis. If you give me Tom Brady against a team like the Atlanta Falcons, who, what do they have? 18 sacks, talking about pressure rate in a 17-game season,
Yeah,
which is like Aaron Darnold versus
good.
the Atlanta Falcons.
Good.
If Tom Brady is off in the first quarter, he's not going to be off in the second, third, and fourth quarters. He's going to find his rhythm, and every single player that he throws to is going to be open. I'd rather focus on matchup analysis than injury analysis, personally.
It'd be a lot more peace of mind. You've got bets coming in on the phone there, Chris.
Yeah,
the screen's
something
moving.
like that.
Adam, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received from somebody in this, as far as sports betting goes?
Well, the most actionable has been anything around having multiple sports books. The best, I guess, philosophical, I don't know what you want to put on it, the best wording or anything for just
your process. We're talking process.
For just you're trying to hit 55%. Remember, that was a text I got a couple weeks ago, honestly, because I was asking about how you avoid overthinking. Because I think my biggest issue is that I overthink everything to the death. And we were comparing thoughts on teams, and like the contrast in teams, like I was giving a list of just like a couple items, but it was still like 4 or 5 bullet points. And like this guy was like one sentence. And I was like, I like yours better. It was like, it makes more sense, but it sums it up. And he's like, it's so easy when you're betting day to day to week, where you have to be like, I've got to win all of this, especially when you have people following and you've got an audience, you're doing shows and stuff. The pressure just goes through the roof because you want to win for everybody. But at the end of the day, if you hit 55%, you're good. And when you get in that mindset, I think it makes you more willing to click and put in bets that sort of are based on like a much easier handicap overall. Is this two teams that I think the offenses are going to be better than the market is giving them credit for early in the year? Yes, bet the over. Is this two defenses? I think yes, bet the under. You staying in that sort of rhythm, knowing that like, okay, if I make 6 or 7 of these a week, over the long term, I'm going to have a chance to be there. I don't have to be 65, 75, whatever. These are 55% bets. I'm good with it. It's such an easy thing, but my God, can you get so far away from just having that in your mind when you get into the weeds of the season? So that's it's always very helpful to kind of get in that mindset.
Last year, I was listening to the two of you. You would have the shows on contest, and you would come out and you would talk about where you think the line would go. What do you think would happen? You'd have those where, I guess it would be where you thought the lines were even going to be set in the contest, because you might even have it before the lines would be set Wednesday or Thursday from the various sports contests. Yeah. What did you like about the show that you did? What do you wish you did differently? Do you think it worked? It was an interesting concept to be discussing this live on air for people to listen to. And I'm sure you had some thoughts about it, plus and minus.
I liked working with Chris for 45 minutes a week. How fun was that? You know what it's like, Ron. Come on. I liked that it was something that I think everybody who plays in the contest thinks about on a weekly basis, but no one ever talks about. So it was fun to bring that discussion to life. I didn't care much for the results of it. I don't remember what we hit, but it sure wasn't good. But it was interesting. We went into the start, and this was the funny part about it. Chris, I don't remember what the percentage you said, but you thought that we would be 70%.
I thought we did 60% right. Easy. We didn't hit 50%.
I don't think we hit 40. I think there's some I think we were in the 30s. It was hard because it's such a different mindset. You're not thinking about teams. You're thinking about how people are going to react to teams. But then you're also thinking about how people are going to react to a price. And there's some game theory behind it on how they're ultimately going to handle it and whether people are smart enough to know to swerve or not. And I think what I learned most about it is a lot of people in the contest, I think I underestimated how smart the average contest player was. I expected them to sort of act like just a general bettor would. And I think if you were to put me in a situation, or Chris, I'm sure you'd agree, where if we had to every Sunday morning before the game started predict which were going to be the most bet on sides for the next week, I think we could do that with a lot of success.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In the contest, the average way of thinking was at like a higher level than what you're doing from day-to-day betting throughout the NFL season. And so that's where I think we kind of screwed up, because we were treating it like just the betting sort of day-to-day average audience. And this was very different. So that was really telling to me as the season went on.
I think what we did was exactly what Ron and I did is, we were talking things out loud, excuse me. And I got buried in people that really appreciated what we were talking about, and they didn't really give a crap about what our predictions were on a Thursday morning, because that's just impossible. I mean, we realized it a couple weeks in. We're just never going to be able to do that because there's just too many factors going in. Yeah, and I strongly believe we would hit 60% if we did it Sunday mornings, but who's got the time for that? But I thought it was great content, and nobody gave a crap or ridiculed us for the bad results, because everybody kind of knew we were biting off more than we could chew to try to be accurate on a Thursday.
It was a tough thing to do for sure.
Would you consider that or a different kind of contest strategy show? Is it something that you would be interested in, or something that you think would, talking out loud again, that would enhance your own contest results?
I never really thought about the connection the show had to how I finished the season. I would think there was probably an impact, but it's a good point. I've never really gone back and thought about that, because I again, like relative to other guys, like I'm not a massive contest player. If I lived in Vegas, it would be a very different story.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. That's a good question.
What did you get, Chris?
I don't think it works unless it's on before the deadline, like on a Saturday. But who's got the time to do it? Is one of my focuses. And then I never give any thought to the lines until Saturday normally in my process. So when we did it, it wasn't in my comfort zone to be kind of on the spot, because I haven't been through the process of absorbing the information that I want to absorb before I initially look. Because, believe it or not, and you can, anybody listening, I actually created a contest playlist on my YouTube channel where I discuss all kinds of strategy, which if you're interested, I recommend. But my process, honest to God, look at the lines 20 minutes before the picks are due. And I feel like I did best on that. And maybe the Thursday mornings were a distraction for me.
Interesting.
I want to segue. You really annoy me, Adam, with your organization and detail, and just the way you are just so well put together with whatever you're going to talk about and everything. Where and how did you develop these skills? Did it come naturally? Do you go overboard on any of it, or you feel like it's a perfect flow for you?
Yeah, I think it comes off very different than what the reality is, for sure. And a lot of it is, I really credit a lot of whatever people might think I do well whether I agree, I don't know, but it just from making so many mistakes, a lot of them, and making mistakes in front of an audience or with people reading it or with people following. I mean, I was putting stuff out on forums in 2007 about betting, like is speaking like I knew what I was talking about too at the time, which was hilarious. But like there's been so many ups and downs with people paying attention that I think anytime you're in that situation, it makes handling anything a lot easier. And so a lot of credit goes to that for sure, I think. But in terms of being super organized or anything, it's not that. I think it's just it comes off much more prepared or polished than it might be.
I have to bring this up because I never knew this existed. The AC show. Was that your first effort?
Yeah. And it was terrible because
it was the first, like you do these intros, and the first one that I heard was so robotic and so the antithesis of what you are today. I just burst out laughing. If somebody wants to search it, it's kind of humorous. There's good content in there, but you obviously were just starting off and nervous, and it was funny.
So there's a perfect example. So that was probably like 2016, maybe?
Yeah, I think it was 17.
16, 17. So
yeah.
I remember it well because I spent whatever, 50, 60 bucks on a microphone, plugged it in, and I was like, we're doing a podcast, hit record and go. And no idea what I was doing, no thought into it, no nothing. Just I remember a couple of the guests I had. I think Ian from Prop Swap. I had Dan, who's a brilliant tennis bettor because I was betting some tennis at the time.
Yeah.
I can't remember who the other ones were. But I was like, yeah, we're doing a podcast. Let's go. And it was just horrible. And everyone, I don't know how many people listened to it, but it was not very many. But it was like, okay, so those screwed up. So like, how do we make it better? Started doing more, and realized quickly, like, I'm really bad having this format. Like me on the other side of this, I struggle with because I'm like, well, I want to be talking and do stuff. And when I was in that, I was like, okay, so I'm not good at that. So I'll try it by myself. Maybe people will listen. Then got better at doing it by myself. And then it turned into the podcast I have today. But it was all, so it looks prepared and organized today. Maybe only is that because that first attempt was so awful that it was like, okay, screwed that up. So now I know what not to do. Let's figure out what to do. And I guess it's worked.
Ron?
Well, I'm depending on what else you have, Chris. I like your podcast. Sorry about the mic thing going. I'm just going to, I give it up. So, I like your individual team previews. I recommend everybody go and listen to them. And I listened to most of them. And the New York Giants are an interesting one to me because while I agree that they're on the right track, they hired the right coach, they have the right GM, the model worked in Buffalo, but the model didn't work in Buffalo the first year that it happened. So I'm not as bullish on them this year. I have like 3 questions on this, but the first would be, how comfortable are you with Daniel Jones as a quarterback?
A lot more comfortable with Daniel Jones as a quarterback with Brian Daboll dictating the plays and Mike Kafka coaching him along than Joe Judge or Jason Garrett. So
okay, that's fair.
For me, that in itself is a massive difference. So much more confident with that.
You didn't like the 3rd and 8 from your own 5-yard line sneak by the New York Giants in Week 17. Who didn't like that play?
Joe Judge still thinks it's a good play to this day.
when I think he set football back about 60 years. I've always been with the young quarterbacks. Now, obviously, he's not a rookie, but you have to have a tall target at tight end because your young quarterbacks are not good at reading the field as well. And you have to have a pretty good offensive line so that you have time. And I'm not sure the Giants have a great tight end, and I'm pretty sure the Giants are still evolving around the offensive line. So my second question of 3 is, How comfortable are you with the offensive line tight end?
Okay, tight end, not a lot, but we know from Dayball he's a big 3 wide receiver set guy. So
Okay.
I like the guys that the Giants have depth-wise at wide receiver. So tight end, not overly confident. Not a lot of talent there, especially with Ingram gone. So not great. Offensive line, I think, will be much better than what we're used to seeing from them. Feliciano at center, Andrew Thomas left tackle, some good pieces on the offensive line. They struggled with a lot of health issues that I think probably made Jones maybe appear a little more flustered more often than he actually could be if given protection. So not confident in the tight end spot, more confident than I think most at the offensive line.
Last one on the New York Giants. It's a passing league. Doesn't matter how well you stop the run, you got to stop the pass. Bradbury is gone from the New York Giants. They weren't that great versus the pass anyway. I'm not sure, even though I've studied the NFL for 40 years, that I could name the roster of secondary people that they even have.
Sure.
How do they prevent last-second losses or prevent decent quarterbacks from completing a high percentage of passes?
Well, you hope Wink Martindale and everything up front can kind of generate pressure to negate that. I'm with you. The secondary safety-wise, they're okay. I think McKinney's really sort of underrated relative to the league. I'll be very curious to see if Adoree Jackson has anything left. But there's probably enough guys that if everything can go right up front with a decent defensive front, that the Giants and their pass rush can protect the secondary a little bit. And so, like last season, the Giants finished, I want to say it was slightly above average in terms of yards per pass play allowed, off the top of my head. I think they absolutely need to repeat that or be at that level. So I don't think you're looking for like a top 10 secondary with the offensive improvements. Making the bets that I have to make the playoffs, longer odds at 10 plus wins, a long shot to win the division. I think the secondary just needs to be 16 to 20th, and the team will be able to get by.
So it's a fascinating give and take. I certainly agree with a lot of your other takes. So thank you for indulging me in the fact that I think the Giants will be a really, really good team in 2023.
Yeah, but okay. So the one pushback I'd say was the 1 year it didn't work in Buffalo. That was Allen's rookie season.
Right.
So Jones is past that. So
that's what we're hoping. Yeah.
So it's like, what's the difference? Well, first of all, the question I think is how much of the scheme aided Josh Allen last year? Because the leap that he took from year 1 to 2 to 3 is unlike anything we've seen from a quarterback before. He went from like marginally above wins above replacement to like he's worth like 4 wins. And so how much of that was attributed to Dayball, the extreme pass rate, the play design? Like was it a lot, somewhat, not lots? What do you think?
I think the fact that he worked with him for over a year and got him to a point, how much is it? Oh, more than 50%. Josh Allen's willingness to learn was great, but no quarterback with that college percentage has ever flourished like Josh Allen in the history of the modern day NFL. So you have to give
55% in college.
Okay, so then we'll do the reverse. So Daniel Jones has had Jason Garrett, Joe Judge. We had McAdoo for a year. Am I thinking right before that? Whatever.
And you're making a great case for your point because those guys shouldn't be allowed to call plays in the CFL, NFL.
Let's talk this one out. So what percentage of those guys made Daniel Jones look the way that he is? Like how influential were they within his offensive scheme?
Yeah, I think there's a great percentage, but I also have a lower opinion, especially in the past, of the offensive line. And I think that his internal clock, which wasn't good at Duke,
there is no clock.
Did not progress. Yeah, his internal clock is broken, and maybe they fix it, and I think they do. but do they fix it in 2022 is my question.
And it's that question relative to, so let's say Dayball's impact on Josh Allen was 60% the reason of his leap. And everyone that Jones has dealt with is 60% of the reason that he's maybe never had the chance to make the leap. So let's say we meet somewhere in the middle now that the roles are reversed.
Okay.
We're still talking about a team that's priced to like 7.25 wins on the season. So it's not like we're talking about like a 10-win team jumping to 12. We're talking like if the Giants win 9 games this year, that's a massive step forward. I think we'd agree on that. So it's I think perspective wise, it's going to be significant.
I still have at least 5 questions for you. So let's try to get through these quickly, though. I'd hope this is all evergreen type stuff. I hope to end with the Giants, but Ron ran out of his questions. So let's fire away this stuff. You said you wanted to talk about pick selling. And
excellent.
Is it out of the gutter yet? What's the future? What needs to change?
Pick selling or pick giving?
Selling.
The big issue with selling is that almost nobody delivers it in a way that makes sense to their customers. And the average customer's knowledge of what their expectations should be when purchasing picks is like so far skewed in the wrong direction that it's very difficult to even know what a good or a bad service is, because nobody has the right ideas about what they should expect when paying someone for picks. Pick selling can be a very good thing. And a lot of people will pay for picks or information at the professional level to benefit them in making their bets. And I think it's either in so many discussions a yes or a no situation. But the problem is that the expectations are all skewed and wrong. And I'm blaming the consumers for it more than I am the people that are on the shady side, because there's consistently demand from consumers for really, really bad products. And I think the expectations need to change.
Personal observations, I cannot fathom how these people continue to blindly chase these big plays. It's not about one big play. It's about long term. And I can tell you, it's all about big plays. Just like with podcasts, if you don't have a podcast with free picks, it gets much lower viewership. So it just seems like the sheep are herded over the cliff chasing big plays. I see a problem with a lot of misrepresentations where people use ROI to describe profit, or they don't even disclose their ROI, and the consumer doesn't even know what ROI is versus what profit is. So that's something that I'm trying to educate people with. And it's imperative that you know what ROI is, because did a handicapper make his profit investing $30,000 to make $1,000, and the other guy, it took $10,000 to make $900? Who do you want? What do you want to be doing with your money? Do you want $30,000 at risk to make the same amount, or would you rather have $10,000 to make a little bit less? So these are the issues that I see that are the problem, is educating the people. And I plan on doing some future videos to try to point out what you need to avoid and what you need to look for. But because it's not about short-term streaks. It's not about hype. It's not about the big play.
No. I really firmly believe on that comment. People are very willing to say, this person's good or bad for selling picks. And it's usually, are you selling? Yes, you're a bad person. What they're not willing to say is, if you are buying picks, which is okay, here's what you should expect from that person.
Right.
And whether that be in records, whether that be in how it's presented, like you were saying, how it's delivered, what lines it's being bet against, that matters too. And I don't think the answer to any of it is forcing people into like a verification system where there's one overarching sort of body that justifies everything that's happening, because those have been flawed for the last 20 years since the internet started. Like, think about the Oklahoma Sports Monitor. I'll go back to that all the time. That was the site to verify everyone in the 2000s. That was as flawed as it gets. And there has been hundreds of those since. And those all have their issues with it too. So this like watchdog idea, I don't think works unless it's a watchdog looking over expectations rather than trying to justify who is bad and who is good.
That segues into your covers release program. And I think it's evergreen because I think that might be part of the future where you have top people releasing. You get everybody to get gathered and you release a pick. I'm curious to put you on the spot. For me, I've got mixed reviews on it because I do like the concept, but are you educating the followers, risking their account status enough to be playing steamed bets? Because this is exactly what sports books look for to limit people.
So we had 1,200 people. It's funny as hell. We had 1,200 people together betting the Hall of Fame game at the same time last Tuesday. So you're right that if a sportsbook sees that coming in, they could be like, okay, these guys are coming from the show. We're going to circle these accounts because they watched the show. And whether it's whatever breakdown you want to have of it, if it's the show has 90% influence on the market because of who's giving out the bets and 10% the people watching, or 90% the people watching betting at the same time, 10% who's doing it, wherever you fall in that, whatever it is, if they circle that because of the show, then yes, you could be limited. But I think that assumption is based on these people are only betting what's coming from the show, which I don't think is true. And the majority, when thinking about the audience segments that are sort of crossing here. So that show is with Right Angle Sports, phenomenal, like as good as it gets at what they do. There were 1,000 plus people on it. They probably had 250, 300 of their usual customers that have dealt with what they're doing for many years, that have been getting down in certain ways on their picks over time into accounts. Then there was probably 200-300 people that come from my world that have been following me and my advice and what it's led to for the last number of years, that have found ways to bet on what I'm giving out. And then there's another 300 plus that come from the cover side, which we know have an average of 2 sportsbook accounts, wager a very small amount of money, and tend to favor things that recreational players will favor. And so I don't believe that sportsbooks are looking at these guys that have they've had a DraftKings account for 3 years. They're betting $50 a night on parlays, and now they're putting in a $100 bet against the spread. They're not going to close those accounts out for the majority of those people watching the show. The guys that come in from the Right Angle side are at a level where they've been being limited or cut off because they're betting at a level so much higher than the average person that they're either used to it or they know where to play it to avoid it. And then I'm sort of in between where I have both of those. So I don't believe that it's a case where people are, the only thing they're putting into accounts is coming from the show, because then they'd have 30, 40 bets over the course of a year. So you're getting limited anyway if you're successful, but I don't think the show is causing more people to be limited than they might already be in their normal everyday life.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you strongly on that. I think you're going to have a fair amount of people that know that a line's going to move significantly, so they're going to overbuy on it. It's kind of a indirect market manipulation that people that are sharp, or you don't even have to be sharp. If you know a line's going to move a point or a point and a half, they're going to overbuy and they're going to chase middles, or they just may trust the information more, and then that they bet out of their normal kind of range, and then that will stand out to certain play for certain people.
So then if we switch positions here and you have to do a pick show because people want picks They want to know what's going on, and there's a massive audience for that. Then what's the right way to do a pick show where you can give out a price that everyone can get, but you also can avoid people potentially being circled or limited?
Well, I don't have the answer. That's why I'm asking you and just bringing it up for discussion, because
it was rhetorical.
Yeah, there is no real alternative, so to speak. As I started, I like the concept. I think it's pretty cool. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
Let me give my take on it, and it may or may not be worthy, but because it was a preseason game, and because there may be 2 or 3 or 4 more releases in preseason games, I think it runs a danger, because you're going to get people who may not normally even bet preseason games, and they may get exposed to betting these kinds of games. If this happens during the regular season, it might go unnoticed. But because it's preseason, the lines are probably more volatile anyway with the lower volume in preseason. It seems to me that would stand out more.
That's true.
So here's kind of the ultimate pickle. Yeah, here's kind of the ultimate pickle with all this. Today's a perfect example. The Mahomes news came out a couple minutes before the market reacted to it, because there was a press conference with Andy Reid that was being streamed live, and the tweets were about 30 seconds after he spoke on the press conference, and then main accounts didn't pick it up till about 2 minutes after. So if you had the press conference, and I have the timestamp specifically. So the press conference was at 10:30 Mountain, 9:30 Pacific. That's when he said we're going to play the starters a quarter, the quarterback specifically. So that info existed at 10:30. The release that I sent out was 10:32. I gave a 2-minute warning because it was obviously going to move. And Circa moved at like 10:34, 10:35. So let's say I have that information. If I go bet it myself, there's obviously the risk that I'm going to be circled and limited, because I'm betting on information that the book knows, and I was ahead of like a 3-point line move. Okay, so that's like inherently built into betting. Whereas if you're using that information and you're ahead of the lines, you're gonna throw flags up. So that kind of always exists. Now, if you're doing content around that, whether you do it for free and you just tweet it out, or you text it out in my case, or it's a live show, it's exposed to an audience that varies in size. And then people would go and bet on that. And if it's the same piece of information that they're acting on, they obviously run the chance of being circled or limited from that, in the same way that if they were watching that press conference as well and they bet it, they could be exposed to limiting too. And so I think the problem here is that if you're betting, if you're betting by yourself and you're doing well and you're consistently beating the close and you're winning, you're going to get limited by books over time. But also at the same time, if you're following somebody who's doing that on your own, whether you're paying for it or it's free, there is that risk that comes up if that's all you're playing, but that's going to correlate with your betting results. So it's almost like when you're doing a pick show in the right way, where you're having success, you're beating close and you're ahead of it, you run into the same challenges that you have as a bettor. And so the assumption still remains that everyone following it is only betting those plays, or they're successful enough that the books are going to limit it.
But the difference is that let's say you have 2,000 people getting the pick, 1,950 of them wouldn't be betting the game all at once. So, the volume of people coming all in at once, and the big after move on the line is just the issue. This is just discussion. We're going to see how this pans out throughout the year. I do like the concept, and I'm not trying to be negative about it. It's just
no. Please be negative. That's what makes it fun.
Well, it sucks, No, I'm just kidding.
But it's hard to do. It's hard to do it right, or what would be like fair and just to the user, without incurring that risk at some point, no matter how big it gets. And I think the reason that it's different is because there's a lot of other shows that have they don't ever have to worry about that because what they're giving out doesn't hold the same amount of value. So it's like if you have something valuable and you're giving it out, there's always that risk. But I don't think it's as extreme as some people might see it as.
When you were starting off, I heard in another podcast that you really started off at the bottom level, which is, a very common thing for people to do. And you basically, were in the slums of the industry that at the time you viewed as glamorous. And, subsequently, obviously learned, things weren't as glamorous as you thought. How do you reflect on those days? How have you transitioned? How do you look back at it?
I don't know how I made it kind of through all of it, to be honest. Like even just on like the forum days in like 07, 08, like it goes back to the pick selling. Like I was 14, 15 years old and had like 40 subscribers mailing cash over the border in envelopes to Canada for like a sub fee, or going to like Western Union to collect monthly subscriptions to a newsletter. Like it was madness. And like I laugh now because Fabian Suma, who's a NFL bettor who's really good at what he does, he was on one of my lists in like 2010.
It's hilarious.
And because he was just getting into the forum side and I was making some noise, and I had a bet on the national championship in January of 2011, the Oregon Auburn game. I had under 73, under 74, and it finished like 19-13, but it was a really big bet for me. And like the write-up that I sent out that some people paid money for, reading that today was like, everything that I hate about the industry now is everything that I was 11, 12 years ago.
Well, you also, which I found interesting, accidentally became one of those phone guys, talking to the clients. And, you mentioned that people were surprised that you weren't shoving the plays down their throat and you were actually nice.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable how you make that whole transition.
So Adam Meyer, he's in prison now for a long time, from what I remember. He had his big website, and he used to sponsor. The reason I found him was he sponsored the Miami Marlins park, whatever it was, in like 08, 09. So the whole park was filled with handicapping ads to call his service, and he had like reality TV shows. It was nuts. And he had a big phone crew that had the lists and the sheets with all the numbers. And what they would do is they would go around to forums and popular accounts or people with email lists, and they would exchange the sheets to get new customers. And then they would put them through like the boiler room system and try convert them into players where they would take a cut of what they won. And then obviously they were getting risk-free if they lost. And they faxed a phone sheet to me. And so there was a sheet with a bunch of names and numbers written out. And I honestly, I remember calling one. And like you said, like I didn't believe that they were real numbers. And I had the little flip cell phone, and I called it with the credit that I put on and was just talking to the guy because I was trying to drum up money and go traveling and everything at the end of high school. And so I was trying to get him to sign up for a newsletter that I was selling for like $50 a month. And the list, he was betting like 5,000 a game. And he's like, well, I'm risking 10 times a bet in juice for your newsletter. Like I'm laying 5,500 to win 5. You want me to give you $50? Like, why does that excite me? And like, he's like, charge me more, essentially was what he was getting at. Because it was like part of the enjoyment for him was feeding off this money to get a chunk of whatever pick he was getting from that service. And yeah, it was like at that point I knew, because like in hindsight now, looking back, I felt like I was like kind of one of those guys that was like pushing people to bet and get signups. And like I thought I was super aggressive in sales. And I laugh now because like compared to what some people were doing, like I wasn't even close. It was probably the most polite thing they've ever heard. And he reiterated that. So it's like, yeah, I was everything that I hate about the industry today back 10 years ago. Absolutely, to the T. I was that guy.
Ron, any comments?
No, I remember those days. I remember those ads. I had a couple people in the phone industry. They used to be score phone people. They give out scores of games, and it would change every 15 minutes. They would have to give out the scores and stuff like that. And there were some sales ads in there too, but that's, I said, that's not for me. I don't care.
But are we not kind of in the same cycle now? Like the score phone, which I didn't get to experience, but I got you would text Google 466-453, and you'd put in like giant score, and it would text you back with what the score was. But like, if we think about it, like the score phone, everybody would dial the phone because they wanted a piece of information, because they collectively as a community were betting on a game that they were looking to get info on. And that's where they went for it. And now in many ways, we have that same sort of mentality or same sort of like ambition from wanting something in just a bunch of fragmented communities. They follow this show, they follow the podcast, they follow Twitter accounts, they follow Telegram channels, whatever it is. It's like that thing, but now really specifically for what you want. But the mentality between calling the score phone or listening to a pick show or whatever it might be, it's all kind of the exact same thing, just on a different medium. And I don't know if that gets, you know what I mean?
I'm telling you, I used to call that thing to find out a late score, and I would call it because games weren't on TV back then, not every single game, especially a basketball game. I would call it every 10 minutes to find out, okay, is there an update? Is there an update?
Yeah, and how many times you check Twitter accounts of people for picks or follow info or whatever? It's very similar.
I would tie up for my business. I would call all their numbers, because I had all of these numbers. So I would tie their lines up, hoping that they would learn that they need to add more or update quicker. And I got to the point where I would call the office and get these people to pick up. I go, what, hey, are you going to update? Hey, what's the score in this? So I have 3 questions left for you. You got a minute or 2 on each, because we're way over, and Ron needs to go to the bathroom.
We were going to get into 900 numbers there, I feel.
No.
What's this first one? This one isn't that important, but I'm just curious at what your initial, just quick thought is. Comment on the future of the melding of regular mainstream sports discussions on network TV and betting discussions of real value. Are you seeing any progress since your interview a year ago? Where quickly, how long is it going to take to get quality gambling content on mainstream?
I honestly, it keeps getting worse, I think. And it goes back to the expectation side. I equate it back to the forum days when there was one forum that everyone was posting on, whether it was Covers or the RX or SBR, Major Wager, like call it 7 or 8 of them. Whichever one you picked, there was like gatekeeping in a sense, where the guys that were there for a long time would be really calling out what was good or bad.
Right.
And it was really tough to get through outside of on like the service play forum or like the junk mailbox side of it. It was hard to get through in the main forums if you weren't contributing something of value. The problem is now that gatekeeping kind of doesn't exist. And it's now what bettors think is valuable gets rewarded. And the problem, as we talked about earlier, is the expectations of bettors reward really bad content. It's, if you think about like our space and the people that carry some respect with them, that are long-term bettors or they've been successful gamblers, I can think of 2 people that have scaled their audience and content to a point where they like jumped off and went into that next level. And one of them went to work for an NBA team, and one of them was put on ESPN.
Yeah.
Other than that, everybody who's risen to these huge contracts or major deals within the betting space weren't bettors. they just became personalities that include betting within what they do. And so it's this mass audience problem where the average person consuming content doesn't know what's good or bad, and they just go with what they find entertaining, which is seldom ever valuable to anybody. So that's the problem, and I don't know when it's fixed.
Yeah, it's similar to the pick buying thing. It's buyer be, hey, if you're not going to do your due diligence, you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
Where do you see yourself in 4 or 5 years? Do you have any goals? Going with the flow, anything specific that you want to reach?
I don't know, because I don't know where it's going to be in 2 months with the way the football season's shaping up. I have a feeling that one way or another, there's going to be some sort of direct community with the audience that I have built in a way that I don't fully understand yet. I think that's ultimately where things end up, because in these last kind of 2 weeks, with the botched attempt at the text messaging service and the quick transition to the Telegram service, the fact that with a couple of tweets, I moved 4,000 people to a text list, said, "Oh shit, I screwed up. We got to go over here." And within 72 hours, 3,000 of the 4,000 moved over to the other place. That shocked me. And I only think that number is going to grow. And I think it's going to be too compelling of an opportunity at some point to pass up doing something community-wise. What it looks like, I don't know. Where it will be, I don't know. But I think that's where it goes.
Last question. You said all media, everybody participating in media, is either a politician, a preacher, or a prosecutor.
Yeah.
I don't feel I am any of those. What category would you put me in, and what category are you in?
So I myself, I change all the time. This summer, I think I was a massive politician with all the limiting and stuff I was pointing out. So I think I took on the role of a politician. When I get to NFL season, I feel like I go prosecutor, because I speak pretty concisely about teams in different directions. So I think I switch. I would say that you, Chris, are probably more so than you know it, a preacher.
I agree.
You're starting to do a lot more media, and you take stances on things, and your messaging, although it's delivered in different ways, you're very consistent with what you believe in and what you know is true and how you share it. And I think that the preacher takes on that.
Do you have, and Ron also, if you thought of an additional question, do you have any questions?
Do I have
Ron
any questions?
or me?
Yeah.
Both of you.
I have one, but you don't have to answer it now.
Sure.
Answer it when you do the LA Chargers.
Okay.
I assume you're going to do them in the next few days or whatever.
My
listeners, the people who watch this show are extremely disappointed in me right now, because I haven't asked my question about special teams and their value. So when you do the Chargers, throw in a couple words about special teams.
Excellent.
That's the only thing I have, and then my listeners will be very excited.
Okay, I'll do that for the Chargers one for sure.
Anything else, Adam?
Well, okay, so you've done how many of these? About 10?
No, not that many. 5 different people so far?
5 or 6.
How sustainable is the future guest list?
Oh, it's not sustainable. It's supposed to be just a short summer series, which but Ron and I are extremely humbled that we've been able to get the people that we've been able to get, because that wasn't the initial goal, was to have some sort of, quasi all-star lineup. And what we started off doing is evolved to absolutely trying our best to create original topics that aren't heard elsewhere. But we've got 2 or 3 more guests, and that's going to be it for the summer series.
Do you think the messaging from the shows is going to get across and live on in the way you anticipated it would?
I think the evergreen content will last for years. I believe that some of the stuff that's been discussed by Matt Metcalf and our other guests is stuff that, Todd, you're not going to hear this even repeated sometimes. You may not hear some of the subjects we've talked about even repeated. So I think it's diamond in the rough, evergreen type content.
The Metcalf
I
one
think for
great.
me, 2 or 3 nuggets that I know stand out in what you've said and what Brad said and so on. I think from a betting perspective, people understand what kind of process it is, not necessarily a grind, but a process, and just get inside the minds of some of the people who have done this for a living. I think that lives on, and they could center themselves in terms of how they approach this field.
No, I think it's been great. And I was very happy. I checked before we came on because I was like, how have they been doing? And the numbers support what you guys are doing. So it's been fantastic to see it growing. And
well, I didn't even have a YouTube account a year ago. So, and I had like 100 or 150 followers on there before we started it. So it's growing, and it's 100% positive feedback. And that's just so rewarding that you can put out some free content that you can have fun with. And we're learning stuff along the way also.
The episode you did with Matt, and it's not taking away from the other ones, which I've watched them all and they're great. But that one with Matt was, I listened to it in the truck driving home one night, both parts. It was so good. And it frustrates me because there are people in the industry that have answers to the questions that are asked every single day that people argue about for hours endlessly on Twitter. And it's like, there is a very clear answer to this. And he answered like 20 of them. And I wish that stuck with so many of these things. Like, we just revisit the same topics on Twitter over and over. And it's like, there's an answer. We know what this is. Here's the best in the business telling you what's happening. And you guys brought that to life. It was great.
Circles Off had a very good podcast the week before. Nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
Great content with the number 2 guy at Circa, Rob Pizzola and his partner. And it was a great podcast. I can't, it had value. But what our goal is to not repeat a single topic in that podcast and just to go on. And just happy that we were able to extract so much valuable information for bettors. I mean, because there's a lot of nuggets in there that bettors may not understand the value of today, but they will later.
Yep.
See, these are different kind of an approach, and it's a real global approach. Probably during the season, it gets more into games and strategy and stuff like that. But for the off season, it really works so that people could have the right frame of mind before we even start getting into this, who's going to win on Saturday night kind of thing.
Yep. And that's the different approach is much appreciated for sure. There's no question.
Adam, I really appreciate you joining us, and I kind of knew we would go super long. We probably should have done 3 parts. I appreciate your availability, your openness, and our friendship. It was a pleasure, and we're going to meet for the first time in a couple of weeks.
Steaks coming up 2 weeks from tonight.
Golden Steer. So I've never been there. Looking forward to that, and seriously, thank you very much for joining us and being so open. And we threw a lot your way, and I think a lot of it has not been spoken of by you previously, and that's what our goal was.
No, it was great. Ron, are you making the journey down to Golden Steer as well?
I will be there a week before you.
Oh,
I will miss it. I timed our trip to be there beginning of this next week. We'll be there through Sunday, but that's about it.
All right. So I'll get you next time, though. But I'm very much looking forward to the Golden Steer.
So am I. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Please subscribe because we do dump some videos that are not promoted on Twitter, so you might miss those. We've got a couple of more excellent guests scheduled. Actually, I don't know when we're going to release you. We may release you after our next guest, but because it's more evergreen, there's nothing topical, time sensitive. But Thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.